I was 14 years old the day my father finally trusted me with something real. It wasn't a conversation we'd planned. It wasn't the kind of thing a parent sits down to discuss after careful consideration. It simply happened on a Saturday afternoon in April, when the basement was cool and shadowed, and my father decided that I was old enough to help him organize his workshop. Looking back now, I can see the hesitation in that decision. My father, David Marcus Chen, though I never called him that, of course, was not a man who delegated easily. He was the kind of person who preferred to handle things himself, to maintain control over his environment and his affairs. But my older sister Emma had moved out 2 years prior to attend university, and I'd become the default heir to whatever projects and obsessions my father cultivated. I was the only child left at home, the only one available to be enlisted into his private world. That particular Saturday, Mom was visiting her sister in Portland. She'd left early that morning, leaving Dad and me to fend for ourselves, a rare occurrence that seemed to put my father in an oddly contemplative mood. He'd appeared in my bedroom doorway around noon, asking if I wanted to help with something in the basement. It wasn't phrased as an order, which made it unusual. My father rarely asked permission for anything, even from me. I'd set down my copy of The Stand. I was going through a Stephen King phase, and followed him downstairs. The basement of our house was my father's kingdom. It was a large, unfinished space running beneath roughly 2/3 of the house, with exposed beam joists and concrete flooring that was always slightly cold, even in summer. Over the years, it had accumulated the detritus of my father's various interests. A workbench covered with tools, shelves lined with supplies for projects he'd abandoned, boxes of electrical equipment dating back to the 1980s, and filing cabinets that he kept meticulously organized despite the apparent chaos surrounding them. My father rarely invited me down there. I'd been allowed to descend freely until I was about 8 or 9, exploring among the boxes and tools with a child's curiosity. But somewhere in early adolescence, the basement had become off-limits without explicit permission. He'd never said it directly, but I'd understood the message through small corrections and redirections. The basement was my father's private space, a refuge from the noise of the upstairs world. So the fact that he was inviting me to help suggested something significant had changed. "I need to organize some things," he'd said, as we reached the bottom of the stairs, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when he was slightly uncertain about something. "I've been putting it off for too long, and I could use your help. Your mother's always saying I need to get this place sorted out, and I suppose she's right." He gestured vaguely at the general chaos of the space, though I'd noticed before that his definition of chaos was really just a kind of organized complexity that made sense only to him. We'd started with the easier boxes, old manuals for appliances we no longer owned, extension cords tangled together like strange metal snakes, rolls of duct tape and painter's tape, and other supplies that seemed to accumulate without anyone actually using them. We'd worked without much conversation for the first hour or so, my father directing me to move boxes to different corners of the space, to consolidate some items and discard others. It was straightforward enough work, and I'd found it almost meditative. The simple repetition of lifting and carrying and organizing, creating a kind of rhythm. It was as we were sorting through a particularly old box of tools that my father had gone very still. "Marcus," he'd said, his voice suddenly tight, "look at this." I'd looked up from the socket wrench set I'd been examining. He'd moved to the far corner of the basement, the part that was less frequently used, and he was standing with his hands on his hips, staring down at the concrete floor. "What?" I'd asked, walking over to join him. "The floor," he'd said. "Do you see it?" I had, once he'd pointed it out. There was a patch of concrete, roughly 8 feet by 8 feet, that was noticeably lighter in color than the surrounding floor. The seams were precise, almost surgical in their exactness, marking a perfect square. It was the kind of thing you could walk past 100 times and never really notice. The eye would slide right over it unless you were specifically looking for an inconsistency. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. "What is it?" I'd asked. "Something I built," my father had said quietly, "a long time ago." I'd run my sneaker across the edge where the newer concrete met the older, feeling the slight depression where one ended and the other began. "Why? What's it for?" My father had set down the wrench he'd been holding, carefully and deliberately, as if it required his full attention. Then he'd straightened up, and I'd seen something shift in his face, a kind of settling, as if he'd made a difficult decision. "Come sit down," he'd said, gesturing toward the stairs. "I need to tell you something." We'd sat on the basement steps, the afternoon light slanting through the small horizontal windows near the ceiling, illuminating dust motes that drifted like tiny planets through the air. My father had sat one step above me, which meant I'd had to turn slightly to see his face. He'd looked older than usual in that light, I remembered. There were lines around his eyes I'd never quite noticed before, and his jaw had a slight tension to it. "That concrete down there," he'd begun, his voice careful and measured, "is the top of a room, a safe room, a panic room, technically, though I don't like that term. It sounds too dramatic, but that's what it is." I'd stared at him. "What do you mean, like underneath the basement?" "Exactly like that. About 20 feet down, there's a reinforced space. It's been sealed, secured, and equipped for emergencies. I built it myself over the course of several months, and I don't want you asking me about it. I don't want you investigating it, and I certainly don't want you trying to open it. Dad, you're scaring me. What is it? Why would you—" "It's a precaution," he'd interrupted, but not unkindly. "For emergencies. The kind of things people don't like to think about. Natural disasters, break-ins, civil unrest. The kinds of situations where someone might need a place to go. Your mother knows about it. Your sister knows about it, though she doesn't need to know any more than you do. It exists, and it's there if you ever need it, but you won't need it. Most likely, you'll never need it." His hands had started to shake slightly as he'd spoken. I'd noticed it because he'd been gripping the edge of the step so hard his knuckles had gone white. "When would I ever need something like that?" I'd asked, hearing the uncertainty in my own voice. My father had looked at me then, really looked at me, and I'd seen something in his expression that I couldn't quite name. Fear, certainly, but something deeper than that. Something like recognition, as if he was seeing in me something he recognized from his own reflection. "I don't know," he'd said quietly. "I hope you never do. But if you did, if there was ever a time when you felt unsafe, when you needed shelter, it would be there. Do you understand?" I'd nodded, not understanding at all. "But this is important, Marcus. This is very important." He'd leaned closer, and his voice had taken on that particular tone that meant he was asking me for something serious. "I need you to promise me something. I need you to promise me that you will never open that door. Not out of curiosity, not because you heard something strange, not for any reason at all. Can you promise me that? Dad, promise me, Marcus." There had been something in his voice, a kind of desperate intensity, that had made it impossible for me to refuse. I was 14, old enough to recognize that my father was genuinely frightened about something, but young enough not to fully understand what. "I promise," I'd said. "I promise I won't open it." He'd nodded, and some of the tension had seemed to drain from his shoulders, but his hands had still been shaking. "Thank you," he'd said. "I know that probably doesn't make much sense to you right now, but I need you to understand that this is serious. This is the kind of promise you keep, the kind of promise you don't break." We'd sat there for a while longer, not speaking, just sitting on those basement steps, with the afternoon light slowly shifting across the floor. Eventually, my father had stood up and suggested we order pizza for dinner, that Mom wouldn't be back until late, that we could watch a movie if I wanted. We'd never discussed the panic room again. We'd gone back upstairs, and the basement had remained just a basement, a place for storage and his workshop, a space that existed but that we pretended not to think about. I'd occasionally catch him standing in the far corner, staring at that patch of concrete, but whenever I'd come near, he'd move away or bustle himself with some other task. It would be a year later that my father would suffer his heart attack. He'd be driving to work on a Tuesday morning when it happened, somewhere near the intersection of Park and 5th. He'd made it to the side of the road before losing consciousness. The paramedics had said he probably died before the ambulance even arrived. My mother had called me from the hospital, her voice strange and distant, and I'd driven home from school in a daze, unable to quite process what she was saying. Emma had flown back from university for the funeral. We hadn't talked much during that time. There was too much shock, too much to handle. The funeral itself had passed in a blur of black clothes and flowers, and people telling me how sorry they were, as if my father's death was something that had happened to them, too. It wasn't until weeks later, after people had stopped coming by with casseroles, after the house had settled into its new, smaller shape without him in it, that I'd thought about the panic room again. I'd gone to the basement looking for something. I can't remember what now. And I'd stopped in that far corner, staring at the concrete patch. I'd thought about my father's fear, about whatever had driven him to build this place beneath our house, and about the promise I'd made him. For a long time, I'd simply stood there, 14 years old and newly fatherless, with the weight of his secrets pressing down on me like a stone. I'd kept that promise then. I'd kept it for years and years, turning away from that patch of concrete whenever I went to the basement, never investigating further, never trying to understand what lay beneath. But promises made to the dead are strange things. They can weaken over time, eroded by the simple passage of years and the accumulation of questions that go unanswered. They can become more burdensome the longer they're kept, transforming from a solemn vow into an unbearable weight. I didn't know that yet at 14. I only knew that my father had asked me for one thing, and I had promised him, and that promises were the kind of sacred things you didn't break, even to the dead, especially to the dead. Looking back now, I understand that something shifted in me that day on the basement steps. My father had shared a secret with me, had made me complicit in his fear, had given me a responsibility that I wasn't ready for. He'd handed me the burden of knowing that beneath our house, beneath our ordinary suburban life, there was a room prepared for disasters, a shelter built by a frightened man who believed that the world was far more fragile and dangerous than anyone wanted to admit. He'd made me promise to respect that fear by never examining it too closely, and for 6 years, I had kept that promise. For 6 years, the panic room had remained sealed, untouched, a secret I carried alone until it became part of the architecture of who I was. But secrets, I would learn, are like seeds buried in dark soil. Given enough time, they begin to grow. The funeral was held on a Tuesday in late October, 6 years after my father had made me swear the promise. I was 20 years old by then, a sophomore at the University of Washington studying finance, living in a dorm room that smelled perpetually of instant ramen and the particular funk that comes from a college student's general indifference to hygiene. I'd been in the middle of a microeconomics lecture when my mother called. "He's gone," she'd said, and it had taken me a moment to understand what she meant. My father had been complaining of chest pains for weeks. He'd dismissed them as nothing serious, stress-related probably, nothing that required a doctor's visit. But my mother had been worried. She'd asked him multiple times to get checked out, and he'd waved off her concerns with the kind of irritation that suggested he was more annoyed by her worry than concerned about his health. I remembered that detail after he died. He'd been irritated by her reasonable concern. He'd preferred to ignore what his body was trying to tell him, preferred to exist in a state of denial about his own mortality. In a way, it seemed fitting. My father had spent his life preparing for catastrophes that never came. Yet, he'd been blindsided by the one his own body had been building inside him. The drive back to Portland had been surreal. I'd packed a bag in a daze, gotten in my beat-up Honda Civic, and driven 4 hours through gray afternoon light while my phone sat silent in the cup holder. I'd thought about calling my sister, but I didn't know what to say. We'd never been particularly close, with the age difference between us. She'd always been more like an aunt than a sibling, someone who existed primarily in family photos and holiday visits. By the time I was conscious enough to have a real relationship with her, she was already entering her own adulthood and eventually leaving for college. My mother was in the kitchen when I arrived, standing in front of the sink, with her hands gripping the edge of the counter, as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished somehow, as if my father's death had physically compressed her. When she saw me, she'd turned and held out her arms, and I'd walked into her embrace without speaking, both of us understanding that there were no adequate words for this particular moment. The funeral service had been attended by neighbors, my father's colleagues from his job at an aerospace manufacturing company, a few distant relatives I'd never quite learned the names of properly. My father hadn't been a man who accumulated close friendships or social connections. He'd preferred solitude, had gone to work, come home, spent time in his basement, or reading in his study. His death meant losing someone who had been more presence than person, more a force that shaped the house and family than a man with a full interior life. Emma had arrived the day before the funeral. She'd driven down from Seattle with her husband, Mark, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophie. Seeing her again after nearly a year had been strange. We'd exchanged occasional emails and the obligatory phone calls on holidays, but there was an awkwardness between us that came from not really knowing each other as adults. We were siblings by biology, an accident of birth, not by genuine connection. The night before the funeral, we'd sat in the living room while Mark watched Sophie in an upstairs bedroom, and we'd talked around the subject of my father without really discussing him. Emma had asked me about school, I'd asked her about work, she was in marketing for a tech company, and we'd both expressed the kind of generic sadness that strangers express when someone they're tangentially connected to dies. It wasn't until after the service, after the casket had been lowered into the ground and the small gathering had dispersed with the awkward relief that comes from being released from ceremonial obligation, that Emma had finally said something real. "Did you ever go down there?" she'd asked as we stood in the driveway, watching people file toward their cars. "Down where?" "The basement. The room." I'd felt my stomach tighten. "No. Why would I?" "Because Dad's gone now," she'd said simply. "And whatever he was afraid of, whatever he built that room to protect against, it doesn't seem like it matters anymore, does it?" "It matters because of the promise," I had said, surprised by the defensiveness in my own voice. "He asked me not to." Emma had given me a look that contained both pity and something that might have been contempt. "He asked me too, but I never felt like it was an actual obligation. I think it was just Dad being Dad, paranoid, controlling, trying to manage everything through fear and secrets. That's not fair, isn't it?" She turned to face me directly then, and I'd seen the grief on her face, but also something harder underneath it. "Did you know he was seeing a therapist before he died?" "No, he was. For the last 2 years of his life. Mom told me. He was seeing someone because he was having nightmares. Bad ones. The kind that were affecting his sleep, his ability to function. And you know what he told the therapist? That he couldn't explain what the nightmares were about, that they were just abstract terror, terror of something he couldn't name or describe. I hadn't known that. I'd known my father had issues. His anxiety had been a constant undercurrent to my childhood, but I hadn't known he'd been actively seeking help for it. The knowledge made me feel like I'd missed something important, some crucial detail that would have changed how I understood him. That doesn't mean I should open the room, I'd said stubbornly. Maybe not, Emma had said. But it means his fears were about something in his own head, not about anything real. And I think keeping his secrets for him might not be the way to honor him, Marcus. I think it might just be another way of letting him control our lives from beyond the grave. She'd left the next day, driving back to Seattle with her family. We'd hugged goodbye at the car, a perfunctory embrace that felt more like obligation than affection. Over the following weeks, we'd fallen back into our pattern of occasional emails and holiday phone calls, and we hadn't discussed the basement, or the room, or my father's secrets again. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. I'd stayed with my mother for a week after the funeral, helping her begin the process of sorting through my father's belongings. It was a grim, exhausting task. His closet was filled with identical khaki pants and button-down shirts. His desk contained meticulously organized files and financial documents. His study held shelves of books about engineering and economics and world history, all of them annotated in his precise handwriting. What I noticed most was the absence of anything personal. There were no journals except for the financial ones, no photographs except the formal family portraits that hung in the hallway, no indication of what my father actually thought or felt or cared about beyond the basic logistics of keeping a household and family running. The basement remained untouched. We'd avoided it during that week, both my mother and I understanding without discussion that it was too soon, or perhaps that we'd never be ready. When the time came to go through my father's things more thoroughly, to decide what to keep and what to sell, or donate, my mother had simply closed the basement door and locked it. Literally locked it, with a key she kept in the kitchen drawer. "I'm not ready," she'd said when I'd asked about it. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready." 3 years later, my mother died. The cancer had been diagnosed during a routine mammogram, and the oncologist had used all the correct words: aggressive, advanced, stage 4, words that sounded like death sentences before they actually were. She'd fought it with a kind of resigned determination, going through chemotherapy and radiation with the stoic acceptance she'd applied to everything else in her life. But it was clear from the beginning that she was fighting a losing battle. I'd moved back home during her final months, transferring to the University of Oregon so I could be closer. My job as a financial analyst had been replaced by a part-time position at a local accounting firm that was understanding enough to work around my need to be a caregiver. Emma had visited when she could, bringing Sophie and her new son, Benjamin, but she had her own life to manage in Seattle, and the visits had been brief and somewhat strained. Toward the end, my mother had become fixated on the house. She'd wanted to make sure it was organized, that everything was in its place, that I would understand how to manage it after she was gone, but she'd consistently avoided talking about the basement. "Your father left some things down there," she'd said one afternoon as I'd sat beside her bed, holding her hand as she'd weakened day by day. "Things that are important to him. You should probably deal with them eventually, but you don't have to do it now. You don't have to do it at all, really. You can leave them down there. Forget about them. Your father would have wanted that." "Mom, I'm serious, Marcus. Sometimes it's better not to know everything. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for the people we love is to let their secrets die with them." She died on a Tuesday in March, 3 years after my father's death. I was 23 years old, and I was orphaned. The house, as it turned out, was entirely mine. My parents had left everything to me. My father's will had apparently never been updated after I was born, which had seemed like an oversight until I considered the possibility that it had been deliberate. Emma had been fine with it, or at least she'd said she was. We'd split some of my mother's jewelry and a few items of sentimental value, and that had been the extent of our negotiation. Now I was a homeowner at 23, with a modest inheritance and a career that was just beginning to take shape, and I was absolutely terrified of what that meant. The house had felt haunted after my mother's funeral. I'd stayed with a friend for the first month, unable to face the idea of sleeping there alone. When I finally returned, it was with the intention of figuring out what to do with the place. I could sell it, I'd thought. Take the money and start fresh somewhere else. Leave behind all the memories and all the weight of my family's history. But something had made me hesitate. I'd stood in the driveway on a gray afternoon, looking at the house, a modest 2-story colonial with a detached garage and a large yard that was beginning to fall into disrepair, and I'd felt something like connection. Despite everything, despite the grief and the fear and the complicated feelings about my parents and their secrets, this house was the only home I'd ever known. I'd made a decision that afternoon. I would keep it. I would renovate it, transform it from a monument to my parents' lives into something that reflected my own emerging adulthood. I would make it mine. It was a decision that would prove far more complicated than I'd anticipated. The renovation took months. I hired contractors to update the wiring and plumbing, to refinish the hardwood floors, to paint the walls in colors that didn't remind me of childhood. I replaced the kitchen appliances, upgraded the bathrooms, cleared out boxes of books and files and objects that had accumulated over decades. The process was both cathartic and exhausting, a way of asserting control over a space that had always felt controlled by others. Throughout all of this, the basement remained locked. I'd occasionally catch myself standing at that locked door, my hand on the key in my pocket, considering whether to open it. But each time, I'd remember my promise to my father, and I'd turn away. The basement was the one space I'd left untouched, and I'd tried not to think about what that meant. What it meant that I couldn't bring myself to face whatever my father had left beneath the house. What it meant that my sister's words about letting his secrets die with him continued to echo in my mind. By the 6th month of living back in the house, most of the renovation was complete. The upstairs had been transformed into a clean, modern space that barely resembled the house I'd grown up in. Only the basement remained, sealed off and ignored, a physical reminder of the promise I'd made, and couldn't quite bring myself to either keep or break. It was on a cold evening in November, about 6 months after my mother's funeral, that I made the decision that would change everything. I'd been alone in the house. The contractors had finished for the day, and I was sitting in the newly renovated kitchen with a glass of wine, reviewing the renovation budget and considering what needed to be done next. The basement had come up on the mental checklist, as it always did. I could finish it as a second living room, or a home gym, I'd thought. I could seal it off as storage. I could do almost anything with it, except go down there and confront what my father had left behind. But that night, something had shifted. Maybe it was the isolation of living alone for the first time in my life, in a house that belonged to me, with no one to answer to and no one to judge whatever choices I made. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of 6 years of secrets, of keeping a promise that had started to feel less like a sacred obligation and more like a prison I'd volunteered to enter. Maybe it was simply that I was tired of being haunted by something I didn't understand. Whatever the reason, I'd set down my wine glass, taken the key from its hook in the kitchen drawer, and I'd walked to the basement door. I'd stood there for a long moment, key in hand, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I'd thought about my father, about the fear in his eyes that day on the basement steps. I'd thought about my mother's advice to let the secrets die. I'd thought about Emma's words about letting him control us from beyond the grave. And then I'd inserted the key into the lock, and I'd turned it. The basement door had swung open, revealing the darkness below, and I'd stood at the threshold, aware that I was about to cross a boundary that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. The promise I'd made at 14 would be broken. The secret my father had entrusted to me would be violated. But I'd also been aware that I couldn't spend the rest of my life being haunted by what lay beneath my own house, by a secret that had belonged to my dead parents, but now, by virtue of inheritance and circumstance, belonged to me. I'd flicked on the light switch. The basement had flooded with fluorescent illumination, revealing itself in all its ordinary mundanity: concrete floor, exposed joists, the detritus of my parents' lives stacked neatly in corners, and in the far corner, that stubborn patch of newer concrete, still visible despite the passage of years, still marking the location of the secret my father had buried beneath the earth. I'd stood at the top of the basement stairs for a long time, not going down, just looking, and I'd made a silent vow to myself that I would not go down that night, would not immediately break my father's trust, would give myself time to decide what I actually wanted to do. But I'd known, even then, that the decision was already made. The secret was calling to me now, pulling at me with an intensity that had only grown stronger over the years. My father's death, my mother's death, my inheritance of this house, all of it had been leading to this moment, to a choice between honoring a promise made in childhood and satisfying a need to understand that had grown stronger with every passing year. That night, I'd closed the basement door and returned the key to its hook, but I'd done so knowing that the lock would not remain secure for much longer. I'd crossed some kind of threshold by even considering it, and there was no going back from there. The real descent would begin, I knew, very soon. I just didn't understand yet how far down it would take me, or what I would find in the darkness below. The basement door remained unlocked for 2 weeks after I opened it. I didn't go down there. I simply left the key on the kitchen counter where I could see it, a small reminder of the boundary I'd crossed, the decision I'd made but not yet fully acted upon. It was a kind of limbo, neither keeping my promise nor breaking it completely, existing in the uncomfortable space between intention and action. At work, I found it difficult to concentrate. My job at Hartwell & Associates, a mid-sized accounting firm in Portland, normally occupied the kind of mental space that didn't require much emotional energy. I processed financial statements, reconciled accounts, prepared tax documents, work that was essentially mechanical in nature, the kind of thing I could do on autopilot. But during those 2 weeks, I found myself staring at spreadsheets without seeing them, my mind constantly drifting back to the house, to the basement, to that patch of concrete waiting beneath the earth. My boss, a woman named Patricia, who had a tendency to micromanage everything, had noticed my distraction. On a Thursday afternoon, she'd called me into her office and had asked if everything was all right. I'd assured her, it was fine, just some personal matters to sort through. Nothing that would affect my work performance. She'd seemed skeptical, but had accepted my explanation, though I'd caught her watching me more carefully after that, as if she'd filed away some mental note about my reliability. But it wasn't just at work that I was struggling to maintain normalcy. At home, I'd found myself drawn downstairs repeatedly throughout the day. I'd go down to get something from the basement, a tool, a box I wanted to move, and I'd end up standing in the center of that large concrete space, staring at the locked basement door as if it might spontaneously open. The locked basement door. That was how I'd started thinking about it. The door that led to the outside entrance, to the stairs that connected the basement to the main level of the house. Not the door that mattered, The door that didn't matter was the one I kept thinking about. The concrete panel in the corner, the physical manifestation of my father's fear. It was during the second week of this strange, suspended state that I'd made the decision to start researching. I'd sat down at my computer on a Tuesday night, opened a new browser tab, and I'd typed into Google, "How to build a panic room." The results had been extensive. There were websites dedicated to prepping and survivalism, architectural specifications for safe rooms, forums where people discussed the best ways to reinforce concrete and install airtight seals. I'd clicked through several of these, reading articles about ventilation systems and water storage and the psychological profiles of people who built such spaces. What I'd discovered was that my father was not unique. Across the country, in suburbs and rural areas, and even in cities, there were people who had decided that the best response to the uncertainty of the world was to seal themselves away from it. Some of them were conspiracy theorists, convinced that the government was planning martial law or that a nuclear war was imminent. Others were more grounded in reality. They were preparing for natural disasters, economic collapse, the kind of catastrophes that had actually occurred throughout history. Still others seemed to be motivated by a more generalized anxiety, a sense that the world was fragile and dangerous, and that the only prudent response was to prepare for the worst. Reading these forums and articles, I'd found myself increasingly drawn into the psychology of it all. What would drive someone to spend months building a bunker beneath their house? What kind of fear was large enough to justify that expense of time and money and emotional energy? What had my father seen or experienced that had convinced him that such extreme measures were necessary? I'd begun keeping a notebook. I'm not entirely sure why. Some impulse toward documentation, perhaps, or a way of making the research feel more substantial, more real. I'd sketch out the dimensions of the panic room based on what I could see of the concrete panel. I'd make notes about the construction techniques that seemed most likely. I'd write down questions that didn't have answers, at least not without violating my father's wishes. By the end of that first week of research, I'd filled 30 pages. The next step, and I'm not entirely sure how this decision came about, whether it was conscious or simply something that happened gradually without me fully realizing it, was to start searching through my parents' belongings more thoroughly. I'd already gone through most of the house during the renovation, but I'd been haphazard about it, focusing on items that were obviously outdated or broken. Now, I was more systematic. I searched through filing cabinets, looking for receipts or documentation related to construction work. I sorted through boxes in the attic, examining every item that my parents had deemed important enough to store. I pulled out old photo albums, looking for any clues about my father's past, anything that might suggest what had happened to him, what had driven him to such extremes. In my mother's desk, I'd found a folder labeled Financial Records. Inside were bank statements, tax returns, investment documents. Most of it was mundane, the ordinary documentation of a middle-class life. But tucked in the back of the folder was a receipt from a hardware supply company, dated 12 years prior, around the time the concrete panel had been installed. The receipt was for $832 worth of supplies. The items were listed cryptically: reinforced steel doors, 2, heavy-duty ventilation unit, concrete additives, 50,000 lubs, industrial-grade air filtration system. I'd sat with that receipt in my hands for a long time, feeling something like vertigo. This was evidence, real physical evidence, that my father had spent significant money on supplies that were consistent with building a panic room. It wasn't proof of anything exactly, but it was confirmation that he had been deliberate about this, had planned it carefully, had taken concrete, no pun intended, steps to make it happen. I'd photographed the receipt with my phone and added it to my research file. From there, my investigation had accelerated. I discovered that my father had also made purchases from an industrial equipment supplier, a charge of $1,247 for items I couldn't immediately identify. I'd found credit card statements that showed regular purchases of materials over a period of about 8 months: concrete, steel reinforcement, lumber, various tools. I'd pieced together a timeline of his construction, estimating that the panic room had been built between late 2003 and mid-2004, when I'd been only 6 or 7 years old. During this period, I'd also spent considerable time standing in the basement, examining the concrete panel more carefully than I ever had before. I'd knelt down and traced my fingers along the seams, trying to estimate the thickness of the concrete, looking for any hint about what lay beneath. I'd examined the walls and ceiling above it, looking for any sign of ventilation or access points. I'd developed theories about the structure. Was there really a spiral staircase, as I'd once thought I remembered my father mentioning? What kind of door would be used to seal such a space? How had he managed to excavate 20 feet into the earth without attracting attention? The obsession had begun to dominate my life in ways I hadn't fully recognized until someone pointed it out. My only real friend at the accounting firm was a woman named Sarah, who worked in the tax department and who had taken pity on me during my first week at Hartwell & Associates. She was about 5 years older than me, smart and funny in a dry way, and she had made an effort to include me in the casual social gatherings that the firm occasionally organized. Over lunch one day, about 3 weeks into my research obsession, she'd noticed something was wrong. "You've been weird," she'd said bluntly, unwrapping a sandwich at her desk while I picked at a salad that I'd brought from home. "More weird than usual, I mean. Like, you're here but you're not here. What's going on?" I'd considered lying, but I'd found that I didn't really want to. "Just dealing with some family stuff," I'd said. "Nothing serious." "It seems serious," Sarah had observed. "You look like you haven't slept in days." The truth was, I hadn't been sleeping well. I'd been having vivid dreams, the kind that stayed with me even after I'd woken up. In most of them, I was in the basement at night, and that patch of concrete was calling to me with a kind of pressure in my chest, an urgency that felt almost physical. I'd walk toward it in these dreams, always knowing I shouldn't, and I'd see that it was already open, that a dark mouth yawned before me like a wound. I'd reach toward the opening, and then something would pull me back, my mother's voice calling from upstairs, or my father's hand on my shoulder, though he was always behind me, always just outside my field of vision, or sometimes just a sudden, drowning sensation of dread. I'd wake gasping, my sheets damp with sweat, the details of the dream already dissolving like water through my fingers. "I'm fine," I'd assured Sarah. "Just a lot on my mind." She hadn't looked convinced, but she'd let it drop. I'd appreciated that about her. She respected boundaries well enough not to push, but she'd let me know that she'd noticed, that if I ever wanted to talk, she was available. I didn't take her up on the offer. Instead, I doubled down on my research. I'd started attending online forums dedicated to survivalism and prepping, creating an anonymous account so I could read threads about panic room construction, about the psychology of people who prepared for worst-case scenarios, about how to design air filtration systems and calculate how many people could survive in a sealed space for extended periods. I'd learned more about my father's illness during this time, not from researching him specifically, but from researching anxiety disorders and paranoia and the kind of psychological profiles that accompanied people who built safe rooms. I'd read case studies of preppers who had been institutionalized for psychiatric evaluation, only to be released when doctors deemed them not a danger to themselves or others. I'd read about the fine line between reasonable preparation and obsessive pathology, about how the difference often came down to whether someone's fears were grounded in reality or purely internal. I'd wondered about which category my father had fallen into. By the end of March, 5 weeks after I'd unlocked the basement door. I'd filled an entire notebook with research, sketches, theories, and questions. I'd compiled a folder on my computer with screenshots of articles and forum posts. I'd estimated the cost of the panic room construction to have been somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000, a significant amount of money for someone in my father's financial bracket, suggesting that this had been a priority, something he deliberately allocated resources toward. It was during the last week of March that I'd finally made a concrete decision about what to do. I'd been sitting at my desk at work, staring at a spreadsheet that I was supposed to be reviewing, when I'd realized with sudden, crystal clarity that I couldn't continue existing in this state of suspended animation. I couldn't keep researching my father's psychology and construction techniques without actually doing something about it. The knowledge I'd accumulated had become almost unbearable, a pressure inside my chest that wouldn't dissipate. I'd needed to open that door, but I couldn't do it myself. I lacked the knowledge and the tools, and I needed someone else to be involved, someone who could take responsibility for the act if things went wrong, someone whose presence would make it feel like less of a violation if I went through with it. I'd needed a locksmith. That evening, I'd gone home and I'd searched for locksmiths in Portland. I'd found a company called Portland Lock and Key that had good reviews and that advertised availability for emergency calls. I'd called the number, and a man with a tired voice had answered. I'd explained, vaguely and without going into detail, that I needed to access a locked room in my basement. I'd told him that I'd inherited the house and didn't have the key. I'd asked if he could help. He'd asked several questions about the type of lock, whether I owned the property, which I did, whether there was any chance the room belonged to someone else. I'd answered his questions, and I'd given him my address and explained that I'd prefer an appointment for the following Friday, which would give me time to prepare myself mentally for what was about to happen. He'd agreed, and I'd given him my phone number. After I'd hung up, I'd sat in my living room in the dark, and I'd felt something like vertigo. I'd made the decision official now. I'd hired someone to break open the door. There was no turning back. I'd gone downstairs to the basement, and I'd stood in front of the locked door, the real one, the concrete panel, and I'd placed my palm against its surface. It was cool and smooth, solid and unyielding. I'd tried to apologize to my father in my mind, tried to explain why I needed to do this, why I couldn't spend the rest of my life wondering. But I'd found that there were no words adequate to the violation I was about to commit. That night, I'd barely slept. The week before the locksmith's appointment had stretched out like taffy, each day seemingly longer than the last. I'd found it almost impossible to concentrate at work. I'd made mistakes in calculations, had missed details on tax forms, had generally performed my job at a level significantly below my usual standard. Patricia had called me into her office again, and this time, her expression had been less concerned and more irritated. "I'm going to need you to get your head in the game," she'd said flatly. "I don't know what's going on with you, but this isn't acceptable. You're one of our better analysts, but I can't have you making careless mistakes. Do you need to take some time off? Because if you do, now would be the time to tell me." I'd apologized, had promised that my performance would improve, had assured her that it was temporary. I'd asked for Friday off, citing personal business, and she'd approved it with visible reluctance. Thursday night, I'd barely slept at all. I'd laid in bed staring at the ceiling, my heart racing, my mind cycling through scenarios. What if there was nothing in the room? What if there was something horrifying? What if the locksmith refused to open it once he understood what it was? What if I opened it and found that the seals had failed, that water had gotten in, that everything was ruined? What if I opened it and found that my father had been right all along, that there was something down there that justified his fear and his preparation? Friday morning arrived in a gray dawn. I'd called into work, confirming that I was taking the day off as approved. I'd spent the morning cleaning the basement, not that it needed cleaning, just because I needed something to do with my nervous energy. I'd arranged the boxes and organized the tools. I'd swept the floor. I'd stood in front of the concrete panel, and I'd tried to center myself, to prepare for the moment when it would be opened. The locksmith, a man named Dave, had arrived at 2 in the afternoon. He'd been middle-aged, with thinning hair and a professional demeanor that suggested he'd seen all kinds of unusual requests in his line of work and wasn't particularly judgmental about any of them. I'd led him down to the basement and shown him the concrete panel, and I'd watched his expression change as he'd examined it more carefully. "This isn't a normal door," he'd said, looking up at me. "This is serious work. Military-grade locks, reinforced steel. Someone built this to last. Can you open it?" I'd asked. He'd paused, studying my face as if trying to determine whether I actually had the right to be making this request. Then he'd nodded. "Probably, but it's going to take time and equipment I'll need to go back to the truck to get, and it's probably going to cause some damage." "I want you to proceed," I'd said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. I'd watched the entire process, standing in my basement while Dave worked with drills and pry bars, while he sweated through his shirt and occasionally cursed under his breath. It had taken him 90 minutes. During that time, I'd felt simultaneously very present and completely dissociated, aware of what was happening, but unable to quite believe that it was actually occurring. When he'd finally broken through, when that locked door had finally given way under the force of his tools, the result hadn't been what I'd expected. Instead of a small storage space or a sealed chamber, there had been stairs, concrete stairs, spiraling down into darkness. "Well," Dave had said, wiping his brow, "that's not something you see every day." I'd paid him $400, and I'd thanked him. I'd waited for him to pack up his equipment and leave, standing in the basement with the open door yawning before me like a mouth. He'd been reluctant to go, I'd thought. He'd lingered in the basement, looking at that opening, probably wondering what kind of person maintained such a space beneath their house. When he'd finally left, I'd been alone with the darkness. I'd stood at the top of those stairs for what felt like a long time, though it was probably only a few minutes. I'd thought about my father, about the fear that had driven him to build this. I'd thought about my promise. I'd thought about Emma's words about letting him control us from beyond the grave. And then I'd pulled out my phone to activate its flashlight, and I'd taken the first step down into the unknown. I'd descended into darkness that had been waiting 15 years for me to finally find the courage to confront it. And in that moment, I'd understood that I had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Whatever lay beneath my house, whatever my father had spent months building and years protecting with his silence, I was about to discover it. And I knew, with a certainty that settled in my chest like cold concrete, that learning my father's secrets would change me in ways I couldn't yet anticipate. I didn't go down the stairs that day. I'd stood at the top of them, my phone's flashlight creating a small cone of illumination that barely penetrated the darkness below. And I'd felt something like vertigo, a sense of standing at the edge of a precipice, aware that one more step forward would be the point beyond which everything changed. So instead, I'd turned around. I'd walked back. Upstairs, I'd closed the door to the basement, and I'd tried to pretend that the spiral staircase wasn't waiting for me in the dark. It was cowardice, probably, or it was wisdom. I still haven't decided which. That night, I dreamed. The dream had been different from the previous ones, more vivid and more specific. In this one, I was descending the spiral stairs, my footsteps echoing off concrete walls. The darkness was absolute except for my phone's light, which seemed somehow dimmer than it should be, as if the darkness was actively resisting illumination. I'd reached the bottom of the stairs, and I'd found myself in a hallway, short and austere, with another door at the end of it, a real door this time, made of steel and painted institutional gray. I'd known, in the way you know things in dreams, that this was a moment of decision. If I opened that door, something would change. The knowledge contained within would become mine, and I would be unable to unknow it. But I'd also known, with equal certainty, that I had to open it, that the pull toward opening it was stronger than any force I possessed to resist. I'd reached for the handle, and as my fingers had touched the cold steel, I'd heard a sound, a voice, or perhaps the absence of a voice. It had been my father, though not quite my father, his presence rather than his physical form. And he'd been trying to tell me something urgent and important, but I hadn't been able to understand the words. They'd been in a language I didn't know, or they'd been in English but filtered through so much distortion that they'd become meaningless. I'd woken up gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs as if trying to escape. The dreams had continued every night after that. They'd varied in their specifics, but they'd all followed the same essential pattern. I'd be in the basement at night, and that panic room would be calling to me. Sometimes I'd hear it as an actual sound, a kind of humming or whispering that I couldn't quite identify. Other times, it had been more abstract, a pressure in my chest, a gravitational pull that seemed to originate from beneath the earth. I'd walk toward it, always knowing I shouldn't, always aware that this was wrong, and I'd see that the door was already open, that the darkness yawned before me like a wound that was actively bleeding light instead of draining it. In some of the dreams, I'd descended the stairs and found rooms beyond rooms, an infinite regression of doors and hallways and chambers. In others, I'd reached the bottom and found that the room was empty, except for a single object I could never quite make out before I woke up. And in still others, I'd been descending when I'd realized that something was ascending toward me from below, climbing up the stairs in the darkness, and I'd had to wake myself up to escape it. I'd wake from these dreams exhausted, my entire body drenched in sweat, my mind foggy and disoriented. I'd lie in bed in the darkness, listening to the house settle around me, and I'd wonder if my father had experienced dreams like this, if he'd been tormented by visions of what he'd buried beneath the house, if the panic room itself had become a kind of monster in his subconscious, growing larger and more threatening with every year that passed. By the following Wednesday, a week after Dave had opened the door, I'd barely been sleeping at all. I was existing in a state of perpetual exhaustion, my eyes feeling grainy, my reactions slowed, my ability to concentrate at work almost non-existent. Patricia had finally lost patience with me entirely. She'd called me into her office and had asked me point blank whether I needed to take a medical leave of absence. "I think you should go home and see a doctor," she'd said, her tone suggesting that this was not a suggestion but a directive. "You look like hell, you're not performing at an acceptable level, and whatever is going on with you is clearly affecting your ability to do your job. I can give you 2 weeks paid leave. Use it to figure out whatever's going on. Come back when you're actually capable of working." I'd accepted the offer without arguing. I'd felt too tired to pretend that I was fine, too exhausted to mount even a token resistance. That evening, I'd gone home and I'd collapsed on my couch, and I'd slept for 14 hours straight. It was the first genuinely restorative sleep I'd had in a week, and I'd woken up feeling somewhat more human, though the exhaustion still clung to me like a fog that wouldn't quite lift. It was the next morning, Thursday, that Emma had called. We hadn't spoken in almost a month, which wasn't unusual for us. We'd fallen into a pattern of communication that centered around major holidays and the occasional check-in when one of us thought to call. Our conversations were cordial, but somewhat distant. The way conversations between people who share a history but not a present tend to be. "Hi," she'd said when I'd answered. "How are you?" "I'm okay," I'd lied, automatically. "How are you? How are Mark and the kids?" We're good. The kids are driving me crazy, as usual. Benjamin just started preschool, and he won't stop talking about his teacher, Mrs. Patterson. I think he has a crush." She'd laughed, but then her tone had shifted, becoming more serious. "Actually, I'm calling because I had a weird dream about Dad last night, and I couldn't stop thinking about it." Something in my chest had tightened. "A dream?" "Yeah, it was strange. I was in the basement of our old house, you know, the Portland house where we grew up, and Dad was there, and he looked really sad, like devastated. He was standing in that corner, you know, where his panic room thing was, and he was just standing there looking down at the ground, and I tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't respond. He just looked at me with this expression of absolute despair, and then he turned away. I hadn't said anything for a moment. The coincidence of her dreaming about the basement on the same night that I'd been having my own basement dreams felt significant, though I couldn't articulate exactly why. "Marcus, are you there?" "Yeah, I'm here. That's an intense dream." "I know. It woke me up at like 3 in the morning, and I couldn't fall back asleep. I kept thinking about it, and I thought, you know, maybe it's a sign or something. Maybe I should call you. Maybe something's going on." I'd considered telling her about the panic room, about Dave the locksmith, about the stairs leading down into the darkness, but something had held me back. "What do you mean, a sign?" "I mean, did you ever think about opening it?" she'd asked quietly. "The panic room. Dad made us both promise not to, but he's been gone for a long time now. And I've been thinking a lot lately about whether it makes sense to keep that promise, whether it's actually honoring his memory or whether it's just letting him control us from beyond the grave." My hands had been shaking slightly as I'd held the phone. "Why are you asking me this?" "Because I had that dream, and it made me realize that I never actually came to terms with Dad. I just sort of accepted his fears and his secrets without ever questioning them. And now that he's gone, I wonder what would have happened if I'd just asked him directly, if I'd pushed him on it, if I'd demanded answers instead of accepting his silence." "He wouldn't have told you anything," I'd said. You know that. He never talked about anything real. It was all just contained inside him somewhere." "I know, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't have tried." She'd paused, and I could hear the sound of her kids in the background, Sophie asking about breakfast or something. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." "Okay. Have you opened it? The panic room?" I'd opened my mouth to lie, and then I'd closed it again. The effort of continuing to hide it had felt too great. "Why do you ask?" "Because you're being weird, and because I can feel that something's going on with you. It's like you're vibrating at a different frequency, and I'm picking up on it somehow." "Have you opened it?" "Yes," I'd said finally, the word feeling heavy as it left my mouth. "I opened it." There had been silence on the other end of the line for a long moment. "What did you find?" Emma had asked quietly. "I don't know yet. I opened the door or had someone open it, but I haven't gone down. There are stairs, a hallway, another door, but I haven't opened that door." "Why not?" "Because once I do, it's real. Once I know what's down there, I can't unknow it, and I'm not sure I want to." Emma had sighed. "Marcus, I think you need to do this. I think you need to go down there and find out what Dad was so afraid of. Because if you don't, it's always going to haunt you. And I think it's already starting to, isn't it?" "I've been having dreams," I'd admitted. "Every night for the past week. I can barely sleep." "Of course you're having dreams. Your subconscious is trying to tell you something. It's trying to tell you that you need to confront this, that you need to understand. What if understanding makes things worse? It won't. Emma had said, with a certainty I didn't feel. "Trust me, not knowing is worse. Not knowing is what makes the fear grow. Knowledge, even difficult knowledge, is better than the void of not knowing." We'd talked for a while longer, but we'd circled around the same themes without really resolving anything. Emma had tried to convince me to go down the stairs, and I'd resisted, explaining my fears and my hesitations. Eventually, we'd said goodbye with vague promises to talk again soon, and I'd been left alone with my phone and the weight of the decision pressing down on me. That night, I'd had the most vivid dream yet. In it, I'd descended the spiral stairs completely, step by step, my phone's flashlight illuminating the concrete walls. The hallway at the bottom had been exactly as I remembered it from previous dreams, short, austere, with that steel door at the end. But this time, when I'd reached the door and opened it, I'd found that the panic room beyond was not empty. It had been filled with water, not gradually, not seeping in from some failed seal. The entire room had been submerged, as if it existed at the bottom of an ocean, and the water had been dark and cold and absolutely opaque. I'd stood in the hallway, staring at this water-filled chamber, and I'd known that I needed to go in, that my father was in there somewhere, drowning or already drowned, and that I needed to save him. I'd waded into the water, and it had been exactly as cold as I'd expected. It had risen around me, ankles, knees, thighs, waist, pulling me down with a weight that felt almost sentient, almost intentional. I'd tried to call out for my father, but no sound had come. I'd tried to breathe, and water had filled my lungs. I'd woken up suffocating, thrashing against my sheets, gasping for air like a drowning victim pulled from the depths. It had taken me several minutes to realize that I was actually breathing, that there was no water, that I was alive. I'd gotten out of bed, and I'd gone to the kitchen, and I'd poured myself a glass of water, which had seemed like some kind of cosmic joke, but I'd been thirsty, and nothing else had made sense. I'd sat at my kitchen table in the dark, drinking that water, and I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to go down to the panic room. Not because I'd decided to keep the promise to my father. I'd already broken that promise by hiring the locksmith. But because I'd realized that some mysteries were meant to remain mysteries. That some things existed in the dark for a reason. That the fear my father had cultivated by not explaining what he'd built down there might be preferable to the truth. I'd spent 2 weeks on medical leave, and during that time I'd done my best to ignore the basement. I'd spent time out of the house, going to movies, meeting with Sarah for coffee, trying to construct a normal life despite the knowledge that something waited in the darkness beneath my home. But by the end of those 2 weeks, I could feel the pull growing stronger. The dreams had continued, sometimes the water-filled chamber, sometimes just the pressing sense of something calling to me from below. And during the day, I'd catch myself standing at the basement door without any memory of having walked there. I'd find myself researching panic rooms again, looking at floor plans, trying to imagine the space based on the dimensions of the concrete panel and the length of the stairs. The obsession had resumed, stronger than before. I'd realized with a kind of sick clarity that I couldn't leave it sealed. I couldn't spend the rest of my life knowing that there was a door I'd chosen not to open. The question would haunt me. The mystery would grow in the darkness, and I would grow with it, becoming stranger and more obsessed with every passing year. I returned to work on my scheduled date, and Patricia had taken one look at me and had made a comment about how I still looked like hell, but at least I seemed more stable. I'd thrown myself into work with a kind of manic energy, trying to keep my mind occupied so I wouldn't think about the basement, but it hadn't worked. Every night, the dreams returned. Every night, something deeper and more urgent, pulling me toward that sealed room, insisting that I needed to open it, that I needed to know what was inside. And with each passing day, I'd felt my resistance weakening. I knew with a certainty that grew stronger with every passing hour that I would go down those stairs eventually, that I would open that steel door, that I would discover whatever truth my father had hidden beneath the earth, and that when I did, everything would change. The promise I'd made to my father at 14 would be fully and completely broken, and something in the darkness would finally be answered. The decision, when it finally came, felt less like a conscious choice and more like a dam giving way under sustained pressure. It was a Monday morning in mid-April, about 6 weeks after Dave had broken open the concrete panel. I'd been awake for most of the night, a new development in my pattern of sleep deprivation, as if my subconscious had decided that even my dreams were becoming too ineffective at communicating whatever message it was trying to deliver. I'd lain in bed staring at the ceiling, and I'd felt the weight of it all pressing down on me. The obsession, the research, the dreams, the knowledge that I couldn't continue existing in this state of suspended animation indefinitely. I'd gotten out of bed at 4 a.m., and I'd gone downstairs to my kitchen, and I'd made coffee. As I'd sat at the table, waiting for it to brew, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, I'd made the decision without quite realizing I was making it. I'd called work and left a voicemail for Patricia, telling her I was taking a personal day. Then I'd searched the internet for locksmiths in Portland, but not to break anything open this time. I'd been looking for someone who could help me with something else. I'd found a company called Advanced Security Solutions that advertised emergency lockouts and lock repairs. I'd called and explained, vaguely, that I needed help with a stuck lock, that I'd tried to open it myself and might have damaged it, and that I needed professional assistance. The dispatcher had asked if it was urgent, and I'd said yes. She'd checked the schedule and had told me they could send someone out on Friday, that it would be a 4-hour window between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. Friday felt like an eternity away. I'd agreed to the appointment anyway. That phone call had solidified it. I'd made the decision official. By hiring someone to come help me with the lock, I'd committed myself to the action. There would be no backing out now, no changing my mind. The appointment was scheduled. The machinery had been set in motion. The rest of that week had felt like a fever dream. I'd gone to work on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and I'd somehow managed to perform my job at an adequate level, though I'd had no real memory of what I'd done by the time I'd left the office each day. I'd attended meetings where my boss discussed quarterly projections. I'd reviewed financial statements and flagged discrepancies. I'd participated in the mundane rituals of office work while existing in a state of profound disconnection. My body had been at Hartwell and Associates, but my mind had been in the basement. Sarah had noticed, of course. On Wednesday afternoon, she'd caught me staring at nothing at my desk and had asked if I was okay. I'd told her I was fine, just tired, nothing serious. She'd looked skeptical, but hadn't pushed. We'd gone to lunch together, and she'd done most of the talking while I'd picked at a sandwich and tried to appear engaged. "You're really not okay," she'd said, as we'd walked back to the office. "I don't know what's going on, but it's serious, and you're dealing with it alone. I wish you'd let someone help you." "I will," I'd promised, knowing it was a lie. "Soon. Things are just complicated right now." She'd accepted that, or at least she'd pretended to, which amounted to the same thing. Thursday night, I'd prepared as if I was preparing for surgery. I'd showered, I'd set out clean clothes, I'd made sure my phone was fully charged. I'd checked the address of the locksmith company and confirmed that they'd sent a confirmation email. I'd tried to eat dinner and had managed only a few bites before my stomach had revolted. The anticipation had been almost unbearable. I'd gone to bed early, telling myself that I should try to sleep, knowing that sleep was impossible. I'd lain in the darkness, listening to my own heartbeat, aware that by this time tomorrow, I would know. Whatever my father had hidden beneath the house, I would finally, irrevocably know. I'd tried to remember his face from that day on the basement steps, when he'd made me promise. I'd tried to imagine what his expression would be if he could see me now, about to violate the trust he'd placed in me. But I'd found that my memories had shifted over the years. The specific details of his face had become less clear, replaced by a kind of composite image of my father that was more impression than accuracy. I'd wondered if he would forgive me, and then I'd realized that he was dead, that forgiveness was no longer his to give or withhold. By Friday morning, I'd been vibrating with nervous energy. I'd called in to work and had told Patricia I was taking another personal day. She'd sighed heavily, but had accepted it without comment. I'd suspected that she'd already made peace with the fact that I was not a particularly reliable employee at the moment, that my performance was adequate but not excellent, and that she'd likely written me off mentally as someone who wouldn't be with the company much longer. I'd spent the morning cleaning the basement again, though it didn't need cleaning. I'd moved boxes around, organized shelves, swept the concrete floor until it was spotless. I'd been trying to keep myself occupied, trying to stave off the panic that was building in my chest like pressure behind a dam. At 10:47 a.m., the locksmith had arrived. His name was Dave, a different Dave from the one who'd broken open the concrete panel, though I'd briefly considered calling the first Dave back. But I'd decided that I needed someone fresh, someone without prior knowledge of what I was attempting to do. This Dave was younger, maybe in his early 30s, with dark hair and tattoos visible on his forearms beneath his short-sleeved shirt. He'd looked like the kind of person who'd seen a lot of weird things in his line of work, and who wasn't particularly inclined to judge any of them. "So, stuck lock?" he'd asked, as I'd led him downstairs. "Not exactly," I'd said. "It's more complicated than that." When I'd shown him the steel door at the bottom of the spiral staircase, his expression had changed. He'd examined it carefully, running his hands over the lock mechanism, testing the door handle, and I'd seen the moment when he'd understood what he was looking at. "This is a security door," he'd said quietly. "A serious one. Military-grade locks, reinforced steel. This isn't something someone installs casually. Why do you need to get through this?" "It's mine," I'd said. "I inherited it. I need to get inside." He'd looked at me for a long moment, and I'd seen something like concern in his expression. "You're sure about this? Because once I open it, you're going to have access to whatever's inside, and I'm not sure you're prepared for that." "I'm sure," I'd said, though I wasn't sure at all. I'd been completely, absolutely uncertain about almost everything at that moment, but I'd also been certain that I couldn't turn back. "Please, I need to do this." He'd nodded slowly. "Okay, but this is going to take some time. This isn't a simple lock. This is professional-grade security. It's going to require precision work." It had taken him 4 hours. I'd watched the entire process, standing in that small hallway while he'd worked with various tools, lock picks, tension wrenches, specialized equipment that he'd retrieved from his truck. He'd been meticulous, careful, treating the lock with the respect due to something that had clearly been installed by someone who knew what they were doing. He'd cursed occasionally under his breath, and he'd wiped sweat from his forehead more than once. There had been moments when he'd seemed to be making progress, only to hit dead ends and have to start over. The door had remained stubbornly sealed, but finally, after almost exactly 4 hours of work, there had been a subtle shift in the lock mechanism. Dave had felt it through his tools, and his expression had changed. "I think I've got it," he'd said, "but I want to be clear. Once this door opens, I'm not responsible for what you find inside. You understand that?" "I understand," I'd said. He'd carefully manipulated the lock, and there had been a final click, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in that small space. The lock had disengaged. "It's open," Dave had said, and he'd stepped back from the door. I'd stared at the door handle, suddenly unable to move. This was it. This was the actual moment. Once I opened that door, the secret would be revealed. All the fear and speculation and obsession would become concrete, definable, real. "Do you want me to?" Dave had started to say. "No," I'd interrupted. "No, I need to do this myself." He'd nodded, and he'd began packing up his tools, giving me space and privacy. I'd appreciated that about him, his sense that this was a moment that required solitude, that having a stranger present would somehow diminish it. "I'm going to go wait upstairs," he'd said. "Let me know when you're ready for me to leave, or if you need anything else." "Thank you," I'd said. He'd climbed the stairs, and I'd been alone in that small hallway with the unlocked door. I'd stood there for what felt like an endless stretch of time. My hand had hovered near the door handle, shaking slightly. I'd tried to steady my breathing, tried to prepare myself for whatever was on the other side. And then, finally, I'd reached out and I'd grasped the handle, and I'd pulled the door open. The panic room had been revealed. It was smaller than I'd expected, perhaps 12 by 15 feet, with a low ceiling that made me feel like I had to stoop slightly, even though I'm 6 feet tall. But what struck me most immediately was how meticulously organized it was. Every inch of available space was filled with supplies. Metal shelves lined the walls, stacked with canned food, bottled water, first aid kits, ammunition, water filters, battery-powered radios, flashlights, batteries, blankets, and tools. In one corner was a portable chemical toilet, and in another, a cot with a folded sleeping bag. There was a small metal desk with a chair, and on the desk was a stack of journals, 15 of them, all leather-bound, all identical in size and quality, all labeled on the spine with years ranging from 1989 to 2004. I'd stood in the doorway, unable to move, unable to process what I was seeing. The room had smelled like concrete and dust and something else I couldn't identify, something stale and old, the smell of a space that had been sealed off from the world for years. I'd called up to Dave. "You can go. I don't need anything else." I'd heard him moving around upstairs, packing the last of his equipment into his truck. I'd heard the truck door close, heard him start the engine, heard him drive away, and then I'd been alone in that basement with all of my father's secrets spread out before me like an offering or an indictment. I'd stepped into the panic room for the first time, and I'd felt the air shift around me, as if I was entering a tomb, or a womb, or some space that existed outside of normal time and space. I'd walked to the metal desk, and I'd looked down at the journals. The first one had been labeled 1989 on its spine. The handwriting was my father's, neat, precise, with that slight leftward slant I remembered from his letters and notes. I'd picked up that first journal, and I'd felt my hands trembling as I'd opened it to the first page. The date at the top was January 3rd, 1989. 11 years before I was born. 15 years before that day on the basement steps when he'd made me swear never to open the door. I'd started to read, and in that moment, everything I'd thought I knew about my father, about my family, about the nature of fear and secrets and the things we bury beneath our houses, had begun to unravel. I'd finally opened the door. I'd finally descended into the darkness, and I'd discovered that the real horror was not what lay inside the panic room, but what it meant, what it revealed about the man who'd built it, about the terror that had consumed his life, about the legacy of fear he'd tried to seal away beneath the earth, only to have it resurface through the dreams and obsessions of his son. In that small, sealed room beneath my house, surrounded by supplies meant for survival and journals meant for documentation, I'd understood that I'd crossed a line from which there could be no return. I'd broken the promise, and now I had to live with what the breaking of that promise had revealed. I sat on the metal cot, in the panic room for a long time without moving. The leather-bound journal lay on my lap, unopened. I'd been holding it for what might have been minutes or hours. I'd lost my ability to judge the passage of time the moment I'd stepped through that steel door. The room seemed to exist outside of normal temporal flow, sealed off not just physically, but temporally as well. A space where my father's documented fear had been preserved like specimens in amber. The air in the room was cool and slightly stale, with the particular quality of spaces that have been sealed away from the world. There was a faint hum, the ventilation system, I realized, working to keep the air from becoming toxic. My father had thought of everything. He'd built a space designed to sustain life for extended periods, stocked with enough supplies to weather any disaster he'd imagined. The cot I was sitting on was military grade, the kind of thing you'd find in barracks or shelters. The sleeping bag folded on top of it had been sealed in plastic, never used. The chemical toilet in the corner smelled like stale disinfectant, suggesting that it had been cleaned and prepared but never actually needed. Everything in that room was potential, preparedness without implementation. My father had built a shelter, but had never needed to take shelter in it. I'd finally opened the first journal. The handwriting on the first page was shaky, less precise than it would become in subsequent entries. The date was January 3rd, 1989, and beneath it, my father had written, "I don't remember how I got home. Dr. Reeves says that's normal, that the mind protects itself. I should go back to sleep, but I'm afraid of what I'll see when I close my eyes." I'd read that single paragraph multiple times, trying to make sense of it. What had happened on January 2nd or January 1st or sometime in the days before that had left my father traumatized enough that he couldn't sleep. What had Dr. Reeves been treating him for? I'd kept reading. The early entries were fragmentary and disjointed, written in the voice of someone trying to document their way out of trauma through the act of documentation itself. My father had written about what I saw in vague but urgent terms. He'd made references to the hospital and them without ever defining what either of those things meant. He'd written about nightmares that he couldn't remember but that left him terrified, about memories that felt false but that he couldn't quite dismiss, about a growing conviction that something fundamental about his understanding of reality had been broken. By the third entry, the purpose of the journal had become clear. "If I don't write this down," he'd written, "I'll start to believe it didn't happen. That's what they want. That's what happens when you're the only one who knows something. You start to doubt yourself. You start to wonder if your memory is reliable. So, I'm writing it, I'm documenting. Even if I can't remember the details, I'll know that I knew them once. I'll know that I wasn't crazy." The entries had progressed through early 1989 with increasing frequency. My father had written sometimes multiple times a day, as if the act of writing was the only thing keeping him tethered to sanity. He'd written about seeing a therapist, someone other than Dr. Reeves, who had suggested that his experiences might have been hallucinatory, products of a disturbed mind rather than accurate recordings of reality. He'd written, "But I know what I saw." The therapist keeps using words like delusional and psychotic break, but those words don't apply to something that happened in the real world. Either it happened or it didn't. Either they exist or they don't. Either what I saw was real or I'm insane. Those are the only two options, and I know I'm not insane. Reading those words now, I'd felt a chill run down my spine, because I could hear the rationality in his voice, could understand the logic of his argument, and I could also hear the way that certainty had started to crack, the way doubt had begun to seep in at the edges. By March 1989, my father had made a decision. He'd written, "I'm going to build something. If I'm right, if any of this is real, then I need to be prepared. If I'm wrong, if it's all in my head, then it doesn't matter. Either way, the act of building will keep me sane." It will give me something to do, besides obsess over memories I can't quite trust. That was when the panic room had been conceived. He hadn't provided specific dates for when construction had begun, but I could trace the timeline through references in his journal entries. By late 1989, he'd started making purchases. He'd written about visiting hardware stores, about researching contractors who specialized in underground work, about calculating costs and timelines, and the feasibility of excavating beneath his house without attracting too much attention. He'd written, "I told the contractors that I was planning a wine cellar. They seemed to accept this explanation, though I'm not sure if they believed it. Does it matter? Either way, they're taking my money and they're doing the work. By next year, it will be done." I'd continued reading through the rest of 1989 and into 1990, watching my father's obsession crystallize and solidify. The journal entries had become more organized, more purposeful. He'd written about specifications and measurements, about the calculations required to ensure proper ventilation and structural integrity. He'd written about what supplies would be necessary and how long they might sustain a person or a family in case of emergency. And he'd written repeatedly about what I saw and about them, never providing enough detail for anyone else to understand what he meant. By 1991, the panic room had been completed. My father had written a lengthy entry describing its final state. The spiral staircase leading down from the basement, the hallway with its reinforced walls, the sealed chamber with its metal shelves and carefully organized supplies. He'd written about the air filtration system and the sealed door and the chemical toilet. He'd written about how long someone could survive there if necessary. And then he'd written, "Now, I'm ready. Now, if it happens again, I'll be prepared. Now, I won't be helpless." I'd sat in that panic room, reading my father's documenting of his own psychological breakdown, and I'd felt a kind of vertigo that wasn't entirely unpleasant, because what I was reading felt both like evidence of pathology and like evidence of a completely rational response to genuine trauma. The question of whether my father was sick or sane seemed to hinge on whether the thing he'd witnessed had actually existed. I'd continued through the 1990s, watching his entries become more sparse and more structured. He'd written less about fear and more about maintenance, about checking the supplies, about rotating the canned goods and replacing the batteries in the flashlights. He'd written about getting married, to my mother, and about how he told her about the panic room, about how she'd accepted his explanation that it was just a precaution, nothing serious. He'd written, "She doesn't believe me about what I saw, but she doesn't disbelieve me either. She simply accepts that I believe, and that seems to be enough for her. I'm grateful for that." By 1995, when my sister Emma had been born, my father's journal entries had taken on a new dimension. He'd written about wanting to protect his children, about ensuring that they would be safe if the disaster he was anticipating ever came to pass. He'd written about teaching Emma about the panic room, about making her promise never to open it. And then, in 1997, when I had been born, he'd written, "Another child, another responsibility, another person I need to keep safe. The world feels more dangerous now, not less. Every day I see signs that things are fragmenting, that the structures we rely on are becoming unstable. I need to make sure that Marcus understands the importance of being prepared. I need to make sure he makes the same promise Emma did." I'd read those words about myself written by my father when I was only a few years old, and I'd felt something like grief. He'd been afraid for me. He'd been afraid before I could even speak or understand what fear meant. The entries in the late 1990s and early 2000s had become increasingly paranoid. My father had written about things happening at work that seemed suspicious, about people who seemed to be watching him, about coincidences that seemed too unlikely to be coincidence. He'd written about his conviction that something was building, that the disaster he'd been preparing for was coming closer, that the time to take shelter might be approaching sooner than expected. He'd written, "I feel it getting closer. I can't explain it to anyone because they wouldn't understand, but I feel it, like pressure building before a storm. Something is coming. I don't know what, and I don't know when, but it's coming." By 2000, he'd started seeing a therapist again, someone different from the one he'd seen in 1989. He'd written about this therapist with a mixture of hope and skepticism, documenting their sessions in vague terms that suggested he was hoping the therapist might be able to help him, but was terrified that they would simply try to convince him that his fears were irrational. The final entries in the 2004 journal had been different. My father had written less about the disaster he was anticipating and more about his life, about his family, about the way his obsession with preparation had affected his relationships. He'd written about Emma growing up and moving out, about how he'd wanted to tell her that the panic room existed for her protection, that it was an act of love rather than pathology, but he'd been unable to find the words. He'd written about me, about how I was reaching adolescence, about how he'd needed to make me understand the importance of the promise without explaining what it was I was promising to protect. And then the journal entries had stopped. I'd sat in that sealed room beneath my house, surrounded by my father's carefully documented fear, and I'd realized that I was holding the artifacts of a man's psychological crisis. These journals were evidence of either genuine trauma or profound mental illness, or perhaps somehow both. They documented the way fear could consume a life, could redirect it entirely, could make someone devote months to building a shelter against an unnamed catastrophe. I'd picked up the 1989 journal again, and I'd flipped back to that first entry. I don't remember how I got home. Those 7 words had contained so much weight, so much unanswered question. What had happened to him? What had he experienced at that hospital? Because it had to be a hospital, based on the references throughout the journals, that had so thoroughly fractured his sense of reality. I'd looked around the panic room again, at the supplies my father had gathered and organized, at the metal cot and the chemical toilet and the carefully labeled shelves. This room had been his response to whatever had happened to him. This room had been his way of trying to regain control, to prepare for the next disaster. And I'd understood, sitting in that sealed space, that I was now the guardian of my father's secrets. I was now the one carrying the weight of not knowing exactly what he'd witnessed, of having to determine on my own whether he'd been sick or sane or some complicated amalgamation of both. I'd looked at the remaining journals, the ones from 2005 onward, the years after my promise on the basement steps. I'd wondered what they contained, what my father had continued to document in those final years before his heart attack. But I'd also realized that I couldn't read them. Not tonight, not in this sealed room beneath my house, surrounded by the physical manifestations of my father's fear and preparation. I'd carefully placed the journals back on the metal desk. I'd stood up from the cot, my legs stiff from sitting for so long, and I'd walked back toward that steel door, knowing that I would need to leave this room, would need to ascend those spiral stairs back into the normal world above. But I'd also known that I couldn't seal it back up. I couldn't pretend I hadn't found it. Couldn't go back to living in a house with a secret buried beneath it. Whatever came next, whatever I decided to do with this knowledge, would have to be decided in the light, not in the darkness of this sealed chamber. I'd climbed those spiral stairs slowly, my phone's flashlight illuminating the concrete walls, guiding me back toward the basement, toward the upper level of the house, toward the world where my father was dead, and his secrets were now mine to carry. And as I'd climbed, I'd thought about the original panic room, the one built not by my father, but by me, the psychological shelter I'd constructed through obsession and research and careful documentation of my own fears. I'd built a panic room of my own, I'd realized, brick by brick, thought by thought, dream by dream. The only difference was that I could still get out of mine. My father had never been able to leave his. I didn't return to the panic room for 3 days. After I'd climbed back up the spiral stairs that first night, I'd emerged into my basement in a state of profound disorientation. The ordinary basement, with its boxes and tools and mundane storage, had felt alien and wrong, as if I'd been living on a different planet before descending into the sealed room. I'd stood at the top of those stairs for a long time, trying to process what I'd found, trying to reconcile the image of my father as a careful, reserved man with the portrait of psychological crisis that had emerged from his journals. I'd gone upstairs to my kitchen, and I'd poured myself a glass of water, and I'd drunk it standing at the sink, staring out the window at my backyard in the darkness. The house around me had felt different, not haunted exactly, but charged with significance, as if the knowledge I'd acquired had somehow altered the physical space itself. I'd tried to sleep and had failed. Instead, I'd spent the night sitting in my living room, my laptop open, searching for the psychiatric hospital my father had referenced in his journals. It had taken me a while to find it. St. Catherine's Hospital for Psychiatric Care, located in Columbus, Ohio. According to the search results, it had been operational from 1972 to 2009, when it had been decommissioned due to inadequate funding and shifting approaches to mental health care. I'd found archived information about the hospital online, research papers that cited it, historical documentation about its programs and approach to patient care. One document described the hospital's method of treatment during the 1980s and early 1990s as somewhat controversial, involving experimental therapeutic techniques and a willingness to try unproven approaches to treating severe psychological disorders. I'd sat in my living room in the dark, reading about this hospital, trying to imagine my father there. How old would he have been? Early 30s? Probably. What kind of episode would have been severe enough to warrant hospitalization? And what had happened during that hospitalization that had left such a profound mark on him? By Thursday morning, I'd known I needed to go back down to the panic room. I needed to read the rest of the journals, needed to piece together the complete narrative of my father's psychological crisis. The partial knowledge I had was worse than no knowledge at all. It created gaps that my imagination kept trying to fill with increasingly disturbing scenarios. I'd called work again and had told Patricia I was taking another personal day. She'd been on the verge of saying something cutting about my reliability when I'd cut the conversation short and hung up. I no longer cared particularly much about my job or my career. Work seemed insignificant in comparison to the mystery I was trying to solve. I'd returned to the basement. I'd descended the spiral stairs. I'd entered the panic room, and I'd settled onto the metal cot with the journals spread out around me. Over the next 3 days, I barely left that room. I'd read through every journal methodically, taking notes on my phone, trying to construct a coherent narrative from my father's scattered documentation. I'd brought food and water with me, some of the canned supplies from the shelves, and I'd used the chemical toilet without much thought beyond the basic mechanical act. What emerged through the reading was the portrait of a man caught in an almost unbearable psychological state, unable to trust his own memory, unable to convince others of what he believed he'd experienced, unable to determine whether his perception of reality was accurate or thoroughly distorted. The key to understanding it all, I realized, lay in the gaps, the things my father refused to document, or couldn't document, or didn't remember clearly enough to commit to paper. In the 1989 journal, he'd written cryptically about the men in white and about procedures that he couldn't quite recall. He'd written about waking up in a hospital bed with no memory of how he'd gotten there, about doctors asking him questions he couldn't answer, about feeling as though his mind was being examined and judged by people who had the power to declare him officially insane. He'd written, "They asked me repeatedly what I remembered. I told them what I remembered, and they didn't believe me. Or they believed me, but decided I was having a breakdown. Either way, they decided I needed to be there. They decided my mind was broken." In another entry, he'd written about a specific memory that he'd labored over. There was a room. I remember a room. It was white, and the walls seemed to move. Or maybe I was moving. I can't remember. There were people. At least I think there were people. But I can't see their faces. I only know they were there because of the sounds. The sounds and the feeling of not being alone. And then the feeling of being very alone. Both things at once, somehow. The references suggested some kind of traumatic event, but the nature of that event remained opaque. My father had been unable or unwilling to document the specific details. He'd recorded his feelings about the experience, his conviction that something significant had happened to him, his frustration that no one believed him. But the concrete facts of what had occurred remained mysteriously absent. By 1992, I'd noticed a shift in his journal entries. He'd become less focused on what had happened and more focused on what might happen in the future. He'd stopped trying to convince people that his experience had been real and had instead devoted his energy to preparation. The panic room had become not just a response to past trauma, but a prophylactic against future disaster. He'd written, "I've spent 3 years trying to make people understand what happened to me. I've spent 3 years being called delusional and paranoid and unstable. I'm done trying to convince anyone. I'm done looking for validation. Instead, I'm going to prepare. I'm going to make sure that I'm never helpless again. I'm going to make sure that if it happens again, and I believe it will happen again, I'm ready." That was the moment, I'd realized, when my father had given up on the external world and had retreated into his own private world of preparation and obsession. The later journals had been organized differently. Instead of the free-form emotional documentation of the earlier years, my father had begun to create lists and specifications and technical notes. He documented the contents of the panic room in meticulous detail, noting exactly what supplies were stored, when they'd been purchased, when they would expire, and when they needed to be replaced. He'd created contingency plans. He'd written about what would happen if there was a nuclear war, if there was an economic collapse, if there was a plague, or a natural disaster, or a breakdown in civil order. For each scenario, he detailed how long the supplies would last, what additional items might be necessary, how the panic room could be modified to address specific threats. The rational structure of these later entries had been almost more disturbing than the emotional chaos of the earlier ones, because it had suggested that my father's obsession had calcified into something systematic and permanent. He'd moved beyond crisis into a kind of stable state, stable precisely because he'd built institutional structures to support his fear. The most chilling entries had come from the early 2000s, when my father had begun to document his family's relationship to the panic room. He'd written about my birth and about his desire to protect me, but he'd also written about his conviction that I would inherit his temperament, his tendency toward worry and observation. He'd written, "I see it in Marcus already. He watches people. He notices things. He has that same quality I have, that inability to simply accept the surface of things. He wants to understand how things work. This is a gift and a curse. It will make him perceptive, but it will also make him anxious. I need to prepare him for that. I need to teach him that the world is more complex and more dangerous than people admit, but that preparation and awareness can make a difference." The entry where he described making me promise never to open the panic room had been one of the longest in the entire journal. He'd written about standing on the basement steps with his 14-year-old son, trying to communicate something crucial without actually being able to articulate what it was. He'd written, "I asked Marcus to make a promise today, a promise that he won't open the panic room." He made the promise, though I could see in his eyes that he didn't understand why it was important. How could I explain it to him? How could I tell him that beneath our house is a room full of evidence of a fear I can't quite articulate? How could I tell him that the room exists because of something that happened to me that I've never been able to fully explain or even fully remember? I couldn't. So I just made him promise, and I hope that promise keeps him safe. Not by keeping him out of the room, but by making him think carefully about why the room exists, by making him ask questions. And then, in that same entry, maybe the real purpose of the panic room isn't survival. Maybe it's just to bear witness, to say, something happened to me, something real. I don't know if anyone else will ever believe it, but here is proof that I believed it. Here is documentation. Here is evidence of a man driven to act by something he couldn't communicate to anyone else. Reading those words, I'd felt a sudden, sharp understanding of my father. The panic room wasn't really about survival. It was about validation. It was about creating something tangible that would prove, if nothing else, that his fear had been real enough, substantial enough, to justify the expenditure of time and money and emotional energy. He'd needed the room to exist, not because he truly believed a catastrophe was coming, but because he needed others, and perhaps himself, to believe that his terror had been justified. The final entries in the 2004 journal had been brief and somewhat fragmented. My father had written about his health concerns, about occasional chest pains that he'd dismissed as stress-related, about his ongoing conviction that something was building, that the disaster he'd been preparing for was approaching. He'd written, "I'm 47 years old, and I've spent the last 15 years preparing for something I can't fully articulate, preparing for something that may never come. Is that crazy? Or is it prudent? Emma thinks I'm paranoid. My therapist thinks I need to work on accepting uncertainty. My wife has learned not to ask questions, and Marcus has made a promise not to investigate. Everyone in my family has accommodated my fear without ever understanding where it comes from. Maybe that's the best I can hope for." The final entry in the 2004 journal was dated December 23rd, just a few weeks before his fatal heart attack. "I'm going to stop writing. I think I've documented enough. I think I've said everything I'm going to say about what happened to me, about why I built this room, about what I hope will come of it all. If anyone ever finds these journals, I want them to know I wasn't crazy. I don't think I was crazy. I was traumatized. I was afraid. I was trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. And I built this room as an act of faith. Faith that my fear meant something, that my experience was real, that someone someday would understand why it was necessary to prepare, to be vigilant, to never completely trust the surface of the world. To Marcus, if you read this, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth. I'm sorry I had to ask you to promise not to understand. But the truth is, I don't know if there is a truth to tell. I don't know if what happened to me was real or imagined, chemical or genuine, past or present. All I know is that I experienced something that broke me, and I've spent most of my life trying to put myself back together. This room is part of that reassembly. It's part of my attempt to exist in a world that no longer quite makes sense to me. I hope you never have to understand what that means. I hope you never have to choose between trusting your own memory and accepting the judgment of experts who insist you're delusional. But if you do, I hope you'll forgive me for not being able to explain. I'd sat in that sealed room holding that final entry, and I'd wept. Not because my father had been sick, though I believed he probably had been. Not because he'd been delusional, though I suspected that might have been part of the truth. but because he'd been a person trapped between two impossible positions: the person who believed something happened to him and the world that insisted nothing had. And he'd chosen to build a monument to that unbridgeable gap. I'd spent another full day in the panic room going through the journals a second time, making detailed notes, looking for any clue about the specific nature of what had happened to him at St. Catherine's Hospital. But the more I read, the more I realized that my father had deliberately obscured those details, whether because he couldn't remember them or because he decided that the details weren't important. I couldn't tell. What remained was the certainty of his terror and the mystery of its object. By Sunday evening, I'd finally emerged from the panic room for the last time. I'd gathered all 15 journals and I'd carried them upstairs to my bedroom. I'd left the panic room sealed, leaving the steel door unlocked but closed, leaving the supplies and the cot and the chemical toilet untouched. I'd sat on my bed with the journals spread out around me, and I'd tried to decide what to do with this knowledge. The first option was obvious. I could seal the room back up. I could hire someone to weld the door shut, or I could simply reinstall the original concrete panel. I could erase the evidence of my violation, could pretend I'd never broken the promise, could continue living in the house with the secret buried beneath it. The second option was to tell Emma, to share the journals with my sister, to burden her with the knowledge I now carried, to see if together we could make sense of what our father had tried to hide. The third option was to research St. Catherine's Hospital more thoroughly, to try to find records of my father's admission, to track down people who might have known him during his time there, to attempt to piece together the narrative he'd been unable to articulate. That option terrified me more than the others, because I understood, on some level, that discovering the specific details of what had happened to my father might actually make things worse, not better. It might provide answers, but it might also provide confirmation of something I wasn't sure I wanted confirmed. What if his fears had been grounded in reality? What if he'd actually witnessed something traumatic, and the world had simply chosen not to believe him? Or what if the opposite was true? What if he'd been experiencing a psychiatric episode so severe that his memory of an event was actually a construction, a narrative his mind had created to make sense of chemical imbalances and neurological misfirings? Either way, I would have to live with the knowledge, and I wasn't certain that living with that knowledge would be preferable to the current state of not knowing. I'd made a decision then. I would read the journals once more carefully this time, looking for any reference, any hint, any clue about what had actually happened. And if I found something, anything, that could help me understand, I would follow that thread. But I wouldn't go hunting for the answer if it wasn't already present in my father's own words. The journals themselves would be my only source. That night, I'd called Emma and had asked if she had time to talk. She'd said yes, noting that I sounded strange, asking if something was wrong. I'd told her I needed to tell her something about Dad, and that it was important. She'd said she'd call me back when the kids were asleep. When she'd called back, I'd told her about opening the panic room. I'd told her about the journals. I'd told her about the hospital and the mysterious trauma my father had never been able to articulate. There had been silence on the other end of the line for a long moment. Did he say what happened? Emma had asked finally. No, he wrote about it, but never in specific terms. It's all vague references and fragmented memories. He never actually documented what the event was. Do you think he knew? Do you think he remembered clearly enough to write about it but chose not to? I don't know, I'd said. I've been trying to figure that out. But I think the answer might be that he genuinely couldn't remember. Or he could remember but couldn't find the words. Or he remembered it differently than it actually happened. And he knew that, so he wrote around it instead of through it. Emma had been quiet again for a while. Then, I want to read them. The journals. Will you send me pictures or something? "I'll scan them," I'd said. "I'll send you everything." "Thank you," she'd said. And then, "Marcus, do you think he was crazy? Do you think we're crazy? Do you think we inherited something?" "I don't know," I'd answered honestly. "I think he was traumatized. I think trauma can look a lot like mental illness sometimes. I think the line between the two is blurrier than we'd like to admit." "That's not very reassuring." "No," I'd agreed. "It's not." After we'd hung up, I'd spent the next week scanning the journals page by page and sending them to Emma. While I'd done that, I'd continued my own research into St. Catherine's Hospital, looking for any public records about my father's admission, any documentation of his case, any information that might help me understand. I'd found nothing. Whatever records had existed at the hospital had apparently been destroyed or lost during the decommissioning process. There was no official trace of my father's time there, no way to reconstruct the specific nature of his psychiatric crisis, which meant that what I had was all I would ever have. My father's own documentation of his fear without any external corroboration or explanation. I'd realized that I would have to make peace with that. I would have to accept that some mysteries don't have solutions, that some questions don't have answers, that sometimes all we have is one person's testimony of their own internal experience. And that testimony, standing alone, was enough to be both compelling and questionable simultaneously. My father had spent his life trying to prove that something real had happened to him. I would spend mine trying to determine what that something was, or whether the search for the answer was itself the point. Either way, the panic room was no longer just a physical space beneath my house. It was the landscape of my family's relationship to fear, to memory, to the question of what constitutes proof that our inner experiences are real. 2 months after I emerged from the panic room for the last time, I made a decision. I would seal it. Not immediately. I'd spent those 2 months in a kind of liminal space, living with the journals scattered around my bedroom, going through periodic cycles of intense research followed by complete avoidance. I'd gone back to work and had performed my job with adequate competence, though Patricia had continued to regard me with suspicion. I'd gone to dinner with Sarah, who tried to get me to talk about whatever was troubling me, and I'd deflected with the skill of someone who'd become expert at hiding internal chaos. I'd scanned the journals and sent them to Emma. She'd read them over the course of several weeks, and we'd had long phone conversations about their contents, about our father, about the disturbing implications of inherited anxiety, and the question of whether preparing for disaster was a rational response to a genuinely threatening world or a symptom of psychological illness. "I think he was both," Emma had said during one of our conversations. "I think he experienced something real that his mind then distorted into something bigger and more threatening. That's not uncommon with trauma, right? People experience one traumatic event, and then their brain generalizes the threat, makes them feel unsafe in situations that aren't actually dangerous." "That would make sense if we knew what the original event was," I had replied. "But without that, it's impossible to know where reality ends and distortion begins." "Maybe that's the point," Emma had suggested. "Maybe not knowing is the actual truth. Maybe our father's experience was so traumatic and so incomprehensible that his mind fragmented it, scattered it, made it impossible to reconstruct. And the panic room was his way of building something solid out of something that had been shattered into pieces." Those conversations with Emma had helped, though they hadn't really answered anything. What they had done was make me feel less alone in trying to understand a man who'd spent his life ensuring that his own fear would be as incomprehensible as possible. By late June, I decided that I needed to let it go. Not the knowledge. I would carry that for the rest of my life. Not the questions. They would always remain unanswered. But the physical space itself, the panic room, the tangible manifestation of my father's fear. I needed to seal that away, to transform it from an active presence in my life into something historical, something that had existed in the past, rather than something that persisted into the present. I'd hired a contractor, a different one from the original locksmiths, and I'd told him I needed to seal up an underground room. I'd explained that I'd inherited it, but that I wanted to make the space unusable, wanted to permanently close access to it. He'd asked if there was anything specific I wanted him to do, and I'd told him to pour concrete, to make it impossible to open again without significant effort. He'd worked for a day and a half, and when he'd finished, the spiral staircase was gone. The hallway was gone. The steel door was gone. 15 feet of concrete now sealed everything beneath the basement floor, erasing the evidence that the panic room had ever existed. The basement floor still showed where the new concrete had been poured. There were seams, color variations, the telltale signs of repair work, but at least the access was gone. At least the door was sealed. When the contractor had left, I'd stood in my basement, and I'd felt something like relief. The physical object was gone. My father's shelter, his retreat, his monument to fear. It was buried now, sealed away, transformed into nothing but a story and a set of journals. But the sealing of the room didn't seal my own obsession. If anything, it intensified it. In the weeks following the contractor's work, I found myself spending more time researching my father's past, trying to piece together a biographical narrative that might explain what had led to his hospitalization at St. Catherine's in 1989. I searched for public records, birth certificates, enrollment records from schools and universities. I called distant relatives I'd never met and asked carefully phrased questions about my father's youth, trying to extract information about psychological issues or trauma without explicitly stating what I was looking for. Most of them had been unhelpful. My paternal grandmother, whom I'd met only a handful of times before her death, had apparently been a woman of few words and even fewer explanations. My paternal grandfather had died before I was born. There was an uncle I'd never known well, who lived somewhere in California, and when I'd called him, he'd been evasive and uncomfortable, suggesting that there were family things that were better left unexamined. Your father had his struggles, the uncle had said, and that was all he'd been willing to say. Struggles, not a psychotic break, not hospitalization, not trauma, just struggles, which could mean anything and therefore meant nothing. By late July, I'd made peace with the fact that I would never fully understand what had happened to my father. There would always be a gap where the explanation should be, a void where concrete understanding should exist. I would have to learn to live with that gap, to accept that some family histories resist complete understanding. But I couldn't quite bring myself to let the mystery go entirely. It was Sarah who finally intervened. She'd noticed that I'd been checking out books about psychiatric history and neurology, that I'd been taking extended lunches and spending them reading academic papers about trauma and memory. She'd also noticed that I'd been making occasional errors in my work again, small mistakes that suggested my attention was divided. One afternoon in early August, she'd pulled me aside and had asked directly if I was okay. And this time, instead of deflecting, I'd told her. I'd told her about the panic room. I'd told her about my father and the journals and the unanswered questions. I'd told her about the hospital and the sealed access point and my own ongoing obsession with understanding. I'd told her everything except the details that would have made it specific enough to track down and potentially violate my father's privacy further. She'd listened without interrupting, and when I'd finished, she'd been quiet for a long moment. "You know what I think?" she'd said finally. "I think you're using the mystery as an excuse to stay connected to him. You're using the fact that you'll never know as a reason to keep searching. and that search has become its own kind of panic room. It's a sealed space you retreat into whenever the real world becomes uncomfortable. I'd wanted to argue with her, but I couldn't, because she was right. I'd been building my own panic room, brick by brick, question by question. I'd been constructing a shelter out of obsession, using the mystery of my father's past as the architecture of that shelter. "What do you think I should do?" I'd asked. "I think you should read the journals one more time," Sarah had said. "And then I think you should put them away, not destroy them. You're not ready to destroy them. But pack them up, put them in a box, store them somewhere you won't see them every day. Create some physical distance between yourself and the obsession. That won't make me stop wondering." "No," she'd agreed, "but it might make the wondering a little bit quieter. And quiet wondering is a lot healthier than active obsession." I'd taken her advice. That weekend, I'd packed the journals into a cardboard box. I'd included copies of the scanned images Emma had sent back, along with my own detailed notes about what I'd read. I'd sealed the box with packing tape, and I'd carried it to the attic, and I'd placed it on a shelf behind some old furniture. The act of putting them away hadn't stopped the wondering, as I'd expected, but it had created enough distance that I could think about other things without the journals constantly pulling at my attention. By September, I'd returned to work with something approaching normalcy. Patricia had seemed relieved that I appeared to have weathered whatever personal crisis I'd been experiencing. She'd assigned me to more significant projects, suggesting that she'd decided I was stable enough to be trusted again. I'd gone to dinner with Emma in person for the first time since the panic room discovery. We'd met in Portland at a restaurant downtown, and we'd had a long conversation about our father, about our mother, about the ways that family trauma doesn't stay neatly in the past, but continues to ripple forward into the present. "Do you think about opening it again?" Emma had asked as we'd waited for dessert. "The room? Do you ever imagine breaking through the concrete and going back down?" "Sometimes," I'd admitted. "In dreams, mostly. In those dreams, the concrete is gone, and I'm descending the stairs again, and the room is different. Sometimes it's flooded. Sometimes it's empty. Sometimes it's full of things I don't recognize. Do you think you'll ever actually try to open it again?" "No," I'd said, and I'd meant it. I think the room served its purpose. It was a shelter my father built for himself and his fears, and then it became a shelter I built for my obsession. But I don't think I need shelters anymore. I think I need to learn to exist in the open. Emma had smiled at that. "That's very healthy. Have you been seeing a therapist?" "Not yet, but maybe I will. Maybe that's the thing I inherited that I should actually do something about." "Good idea," Emma had said, "though I'd recommend someone who specializes in family trauma and inherited anxiety, not someone who's going to pathologize everything or try to convince you that your feelings are irrational. Someone who understands that fear is often a rational response to a world that actually is, in many ways, genuinely threatening." We'd talked about our father for a while longer, and then we'd moved on to other topics. Her kids, my work, the general logistical challenges of being siblings who lived on opposite coasts but who'd suddenly been forced to confront shared family trauma. When we'd said goodbye, Emma had hugged me longer than usual, and I'd felt something like forgiveness in that embrace. Not forgiveness that I'd asked for, but perhaps forgiveness that I needed anyway. Forgiveness for breaking my promise, for opening the sealed room, for dragging both of us into the obsessive search for understanding. The autumn had been quiet and relatively uneventful. I'd continued my job at Hartwell and Associates, and I'd noticed that Patricia had stopped watching me with suspicion, that I'd been fully reintegrated into the normal rhythms of work. I'd gone to therapy, Sarah's recommendation had stuck, and I'd found a therapist named Dr. Mendez who specialized in trauma and family systems. I'd started talking about my father, about my own anxiety tendencies, about the way I'd inherited not just genes, but also patterns of thinking about danger and safety. By November, it was becoming clear that I was going to be okay. Not recovered. Recovery implied a return to a previous state, and I wasn't going to return to the state I'd been in before opening the panic room, but integrated. I was learning to carry the knowledge without being overwhelmed by it, to live with the mystery without needing to solve it. The only times I thought about the panic room were at night, when I was drifting off to sleep, or in those moments of transition between waking and dreaming, where the mind wanders through surreal landscapes. In these moments, I would sometimes imagine the sealed room beneath my house. I would imagine it in darkness, untouched, containing all of my father's carefully organized supplies slowly deteriorating. I would imagine the metal cot and the portable toilet and the empty desk where the journals had been. I would imagine the water filters and the batteries and the canned food all slowly expiring, their usefulness diminishing with each passing year. And I would wonder what would happen to all of that when I eventually died. Would whoever inherited the house after me ever discover what lay sealed beneath the concrete? Would they, like me, break through and try to understand? Would they construct their own obsession around the artifacts of my father's fear? Or would they simply leave it sealed, accepting that some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries? One night in late November, I had a dream about the panic room. In the dream, I'd broken through the concrete ceiling and I descended the spiral stairs again. The hallway at the bottom was exactly as I remembered it, and the steel door opened onto the underground chamber. But this time, instead of being empty or organized as I'd last seen it, the room was filled with water. Not gradually, not seeping in from some failed seal. The entire room was submerged, as if it existed at the bottom of an ocean, and the water was dark and cold and absolutely opaque. I'd stood in the hallway, staring at this water-filled chamber, and I'd realized that my father was in there somewhere, drowning or already drowned, trapped in the room he'd spent so many years building. I'd waded into the water, and it had been exactly as cold as I'd expected. It had risen around me, ankles, knees, thighs, waist, pulling me down with a weight that felt almost intentional. I'd tried to call out for my father, but no sound had come. I'd tried to breathe, and water had filled my lungs. I'd woken up suffocating, thrashing against my sheets, gasping for air like a drowning victim pulled from the depths. It had been the same nightmare that had haunted me before I'd opened the panic room. The same dream that had suggested, in its way, that I needed to break through the ceiling, that I needed to access what lay beneath. But this time, when I'd woken up, I'd felt different about it. I'd felt like it was a necessary dream, a way for my subconscious to process the fact that I'd transgressed, that I'd violated my father's wishes, that I'd opened something that was supposed to remain closed. The dream wasn't a warning. It was a resolution. It was the final piece of psychological work required to integrate the experience of breaking the promise and living with the consequences. By the time I'd gotten out of bed and made coffee, the dream had mostly faded, though its emotional residue remained. I'd sat in my kitchen as dawn broke over Portland, and I'd thought about my father and the panic room and the sealed chamber now buried beneath concrete. I'd thought about his attempts to document his own fear, to make it real and solid and undeniable through the act of writing it down. I'd thought about the way he'd built a physical shelter as a response to psychological danger that he couldn't quite articulate. I'd thought about the cycle repeating, my own obsession with understanding his obsession, my own construction of mental shelters to protect myself from the uncertainty of not knowing, and I'd made peace with it, finally and completely. I couldn't change the fact that I'd opened the panic room. I couldn't undo the violation of my father's wishes. I couldn't go back to a state of innocent obedience to a promise made on basement steps at 14 years old. What I could do was move forward, carrying the knowledge, accepting the mystery, and refusing to let the search for understanding become its own kind of disaster. The panic room was sealed now, not just physically, but psychologically. It had served its purpose as shelter, as mystery, as catalyst for understanding that some secrets are kept for reasons that make sense within their own logic, even when we can't fully comprehend from the outside. In the weeks that followed, I found myself thinking about the house differently. It was no longer just a structure containing a secret. It was a physical manifestation of my family's attempt to deal with fear, to prepare for disaster, to create spaces where safety might be possible in an uncertain world. And perhaps, I thought, that was all any of us were doing. Perhaps we were all building our own panic rooms, some physical, some psychological, some existing in the daily rituals of routine and preparation. Perhaps the difference between my father and the rest of the world was simply one of degree rather than kind. His shelter was more obvious, more extreme, more impossible to ignore. But everyone was building something. Everyone was preparing in their own way for the disasters that might come. I didn't know if my father had been right about the world being dangerous. I didn't know if his fear had been justified, or if it had been pathological distortion of a genuine but ordinary anxiety. I didn't know what had happened to him at St. Catherine's Hospital, or what he'd experienced that had been so traumatic that he couldn't quite explain it even to himself. But I knew that he had loved me. That much was clear in the journals, in his desire to protect me, in his terrible choice to make me promise not to open the door. He'd been trying to shield me from his own terror by making me complicit in his secret, and I'd eventually broken that shield, had opened the door, had discovered the truth of his fear. Not the specific truth of what had happened to him, but the larger truth of what fear could do to a person, how it could consume a life, how it could persist across generations, how it could transform a man into someone who spent most of his time preparing for catastrophes that might never come. By winter, the dreams had stopped coming. The obsession had faded to a low background hum, something I was aware of, but that no longer dominated my waking thoughts. The journals remained boxed in my attic, and I didn't go looking for them. When people asked about my parents, I gave them the simple facts. My father died of a heart attack when I was 19. My mother died of cancer when I was 23. I told them the house was something I'd inherited and renovated. I didn't tell them about the panic room, or the journals, or the sealed chamber beneath the basement floor. Those secrets, I'd decided, would remain mine. Not because I wanted to keep them hidden, but because some stories require too much context to explain quickly, because some family traumas are too specific and too intimate to transform into casual conversation. The panic room had been my father's secret. It had become, briefly, my obsession, but it would not become my defining characteristic. I would not spend my entire life trying to explain something that ultimately had no complete explanation. Instead, I would live as deliberately and as openly as possible. I would seek understanding where it was available, but accept mystery where it wasn't. I would prepare for some disasters, the reasonable, foreseeable ones, but I wouldn't spend my life in anticipation of catastrophes that might never arrive. I would, in other words, try to live differently from my father, not by pretending that the world wasn't dangerous, but by accepting that danger was part of existence and that the proper response wasn't to retreat into sealed chambers, but to engage with the world as fully as possible, despite that danger. Someday, probably decades from now, someone would inherit this house. They would renovate it or tear it down. They might discover the sealed concrete panel in the basement floor. They might wonder what lay beneath it, might be tempted to break through and find out. And if they did, they would discover either nothing, just more concrete, more earth, or they would discover the remnants of my father's shelter, his supplies, his carefully documented fear. Either way, they would be experiencing what I had experienced. The collision between knowledge and mystery, between the desire to understand and the resistance of the past to complete understanding. They would have to decide, as I had, what to do with that knowledge, whether to seek answers or accept ambiguity, whether to be consumed by the mystery or to let it exist at the edges of their awareness, important but not controlling. I hoped they would choose the latter. I hoped they would find whatever peace comes from living with unanswered questions. I hoped they would understand that sometimes the most important thing we can do is not to understand, is not to expose every secret, is not to demand complete clarity from a world that often works in shadows and uncertainty. The panic room had taught me that much, at least, that sometimes the shelter we build, whether physical or psychological, isn't actually protection from external threats, but from our own need to know, our own need to control, our own desperate hope that understanding will somehow make us safe, and that the real escape from that shelter, when it finally comes, is the acceptance that safety might never be certain, that understanding might never be complete, and that we can still choose to live anyway. In the darkness of late December, in a house that was now mine, and that would someday be someone else's, I stood in the basement and I placed my hand on that concrete ceiling. I felt its solidity, its permanence, its absolute refusal to give up the secrets it contained, and I smiled, because I had finally, after months of obsession and investigation, learned to let go. I had finally understood that my father's panic room wasn't a puzzle to solve, but a monument to accept. I had finally stopped trying to understand what couldn't be fully understood, and had started, instead, to simply live. The panic room remained sealed beneath the house, a secret grave, a tomb of preserved fear and preparation, and I remained above it, in the light, choosing to engage with the world despite its dangers, despite its uncertainties, despite the fact that I would never completely understand what had driven my father to build such a shelter. That choice, I realized, was its own kind of survival, not shelter from disaster, but engagement with existence, not preparation for catastrophe, but participation in the ordinary miracles of being alive. And that, finally, was enough.